My next train was the showpiece of another company, the London and North Eastern Railway. And this train's fame eclipsed even that of the Cornish Riviera Express.
The Flying Scotsman, eager to be on her way to repeat history.
I rendezvous with it at a suitably distinguished point of departure. I'm at the Balmoral Hotel, Edinburgh, known to older guests as the North British, after the railway company that built it. The same company built that, Edinburgh Waverley Station, which looks rather like a garden centre from up here. I'm in town to catch the Flying Scotsman, the pride of the East Coast Main Line, the flagship of the London and North Eastern Railway. And look, still here on the timetable today, FS. Well, you don't need much bigging up when you're the most famous train in the world.
The train now arriving at platform 11 is the 0540 Flying Scotsman service to London King's Cross. Stopping at Newcastle and London King's Cross.
The current train is run by the new operators of the East Coast Main Line, Stagecoach and Virgin. They've kept the name. Imagine how much more boring that would look without the words Flying Scotsman. Our train has an actual locomotive on the front, a rarity today. A loco of this type, Class 91, holds the current British speed record of 161 miles an hour, which makes it a fitting engine to pull this train. By the way, it is the train I'm talking about, not the steam locomotive that was also called the Flying Scotsman. Sometimes lightning struck for train spotters, and the Flying Scotsman train was hauled by the Flying Scotsman locomotive, but not always. Apart from a brief interruption a few years back, the name of this train has survived since 1924. Traditionally, the Flying Scotsman went both ways, up and down in railway terms, leaving King's Cross in London and Edinburgh Waverley at the civilised time of 10 a.m. Today, the Scotsman is one way only, to London, and it leaves Waverley at the challenging, for some of us, time of 0540. Its early departure time reflects its purpose, to compete with domestic airlines for the business market. This echoes the older Flying Scotsman, many of whose passengers would have been travelling for business. The suit's not quite right, I know, but I'm trying to imagine myself as an Edinburgh solicitor on a business trip in about 1930. The firm's paying, and come to think of it, I'm a senior partner, so of course I'm in first class.
First class would have been businessmen going down to London or up to Edinburgh. It would have been quite a splendid journey, but probably a pause in your working life if you're a businessman between, say, seeing the banking insurance people down in London and maybe some of the shipping people, and going up and seeing whichever industry you were in, you know, chemicals, steel, shipbuilding, whatever it was that was keeping you in Edinburgh.
The 30s journey would have taken all day, and that day was to be enjoyed, with perhaps a little thinking about business. Things are quite different now. The interwar Scotsman would have reached its destination just nicely in time for the end of the working day, about 5 o'clock. This train will get to King's Cross at 9:40, in time for the beginning of the working day. The business climate of today is much more frenetic, and although it's only 5:45 a.m, most people on this train are already working. The airline-style at-seat breakfast promotes a working rather than a leisure environment. And this train is like a plane, really, in that it will ignore all the stations between Edinburgh and London except Newcastle. But back in 1928, the Scotsman began doing this run from London to Edinburgh non-stop. A sensational feat for a steam train, and the USP of the Flying Scotsman. And on board the early non-stop runs, it boasted services that would be unimaginable on any British train today.
Services you were offered on the non-stop. If you're first class, of course, you've got your own dining car, Louis XVI style, very comfortable seats. You also had people came through the train that offered in newspapers. If you're a lady, there was a ladies' retiring room, there was a hairdresser. They offered things like vibro massage.
For a while, the Flying Scotsman boasted a cinema carriage, a barber, a cocktail bar that served the Flying Scotsman cocktail, whiskey, vermouth, Angostura bitters, sugar and ice. Apparently, it could have felled a horse. The cocktail persisted, but the barber didn't. Probably just as well in view of his cutthroat razor. Basically, he was a publicity stunt. And we ought to ask, why was this train trying so hard? The answer? To stave off the competition. To detour into a bit of railway history. In the interwar years, Britain's trains were run by 4 private companies. The Southern, the GWR, the London, Midland and Scottish, and the London and North Eastern Railway, owners of the Scotsman. And of the 4, the LNER was the least well off, so they had to be particularly canny in the fight for customers. The Flying Scotsman train arose from competition between 2 of the companies of the Big 4, the London, Midland and Scottish on the West Coast route, and the London and North Eastern Railway here on the East Coast route. You could get from London to most places in Scotland by either company, so they were locked in a competition for speed. We can think of these 2 routes as like 2 drag racing tracks. The LMS's expresses pounding up the west coast, the LNER's up the east. And if you had a fast train in those days, you were jolly well going to give it a name. As for the theme of those names, well, it was enough to turn anyone Republican. The Coronation Scot, the Royal Scot, the Silver Jubilee. It was the Flying Scotsman that was the star performer. This was partly because the LNER was better at self-promotion. They made sure everyone knew their flagship-named train was fast by staging dramatic events. For instance, in 1931, the Scotsman supposedly raced a Dart speedboat and a de Havilland Puss Moth, a plane with a top speed of 124 miles an hour. It had all the drama and all the integrity of a Top Gear stunt.
They were just trying to up the ante, take it a little bit further, so that they got their picture in the London papers. And they were very good at that, and making sure that they got the profile they wanted for their train, because then some of the glamour kind of spread around the network. So if you were sat on a train trundling through the potato fields of Norfolk that wasn't going particularly quickly, you might think, oh, you know, with a couple of connections, I could be on the Flying Scotsman.
For most of the year, the view down this East Coast route is in darkness, since the Scotsman leaves before dawn. But in summer, it's worth looking up from your laptop. The highlight is the crossing of the Royal Border Bridge at Berwick. That was a box that every rail fan wanted to tick. In about half an hour, we'll be stopping at Newcastle. In the brilliant and brutal crime film of 1971, Get Carter, Michael Caine leaves London for Newcastle, probably travelling on the Flying Scotsman. Well, it would be just like him to catch a named train rather than an anonymous one. In the opening credits, we see him in a BR Mark II first-class compartment of the kind that I practically grew up in. Never looked quite as good as Caine, of course. He's behaving in a very civilised manner, reading Farewell, My Lovely. We see him going to the dining car, which still existed in 1971. I think the director, Mike Hodges, was saying, here is a man who does things correctly. He eats his soup in the approved manner, moving the spoon away from himself. But pretty soon, he'll be throwing people off the multi-storey car park at Gateshead.
Good morning, this is 704 service for London King's Cross only, on departure from Newcastle, the next station stop.
At 7 o'clock, we pull into Newcastle, an airily beautiful station. We are joined by less bleary travellers, and the staff gear up to serve a second lot of breakfasts. Now we are non-stop to London.
Morning, lights on Light of Trigger, aboard the 704, London King's East Coast Flying Scotsman service to London King's Cross.
The many bridges over the Tyne. They attest to an industrial heritage. Ships, coal, steel. The view from the windows of the Flying Scotsman would have changed around here in a way that would have gratified passengers. They were passing through a literal powerhouse. Here's a book by an enigmatic chap called S.N. Pike. Nobody seems to know what S.N. stood for. Mile by Mile on Britain's Railways. He chronicled the main lines of Britain in the late 1930s. Of the stretch south from Newcastle for 30 miles or so, he says, of the East Coast main line. We are now approaching a highly industrialised part of the country, and in the next few miles, many single-line railways will be seen branching away to the right and left to serve the collieries, steelworks and other heavy industries hereabout. That would have been part of the glamour of the Flying Scotsman, the sense of being adjacent to the beating heart of England. That organ is rather harder to locate these days. Approaching York, we've come about 200 miles, and we're roughly halfway through our journey. We're not going to call it York, just as the interwar non-stopping Scotsman didn't call it York. This is in fact the only modern-day express on the East Coast main line that doesn't call it York. I'm a bit annoyed about that. York's important. Took up 30 pages of the old Bradshaw timetable, did York. And I was born there.
Would customers at platform 3 please stand well clear from the approaching train? There is a non-stop train approaching.
But ignoring my hometown was part of the LNER's grand plan. The Scotsman's non-stop run was a logistical coup for the company. It's actually very hard to timetable a genuine express because, if you think about it, all the other normal stopping trains get in the way. In 1928, as part of their PR campaign for the non-stop runs, the LNER offered all possible assistance to the makers of a feature film called The Flying Scotsman. When they saw the result, they wished they hadn't. It showed much inadvisable passenger behaviour. Far graver matters than feet on seats. Passengers climbed in and out of the carriages without necessarily waiting for the train to stop. The footplate crew were not paying attention. This was not how the LNER wanted to depict its crack express. What particularly annoyed Nigel Gresley, chief mechanical engineer of the LNER, was when the villain uncoupled the locomotive from the train using only a penknife. Gresley insisted on a disclaimer. For the purposes of the film, dramatic license has been taken with the safety features of the Flying Scotsman. By the time we get south of Peterborough, our train is racing along at over 100 miles an hour. Sir John Betjeman used to say the train made a different sound on this fenland because the rails were laid down on beds of reeds. The modern passenger sees no reed beds. In recent years, the profitability of rapeseed oil has made Britain not so much a green and pleasant land as a yellow one. It's very easy to go to sleep when alongside these vast fields. On the old Scotsman, the cause of tiredness would have been drinking that Flying Scotsman cocktail before a 5-course lunch accompanied by half a bottle of wine. On the present day one, it's rather more to do with having got out of bed at 5 o'clock. Bang on time, we reach the outskirts of London and make our way into King's Cross Station.
Only people come into King's Cross today, but until the 1970s, when the southern power stations went over to oil, tons of coal flowed in by day and by night. Apparently the station reeked of coal.
In the last 40 years, London has waxed as the north has waned. That the modern Scotsman terminates at London rather than Edinburgh perhaps shows the greater magnetic pull of the capital.
There was a better north-south balance in those days, and our Scottish solicitor wouldn't have felt remotely intimidated about being in the capital. Also, he'd be dropping the name of the train that brought him here when he got to his business meetings. Came up on the Scotsman. The run was trouble-free.
His enthusiasm for the train would remain unabated. That for the capital might have been checked, however, when he was immediately reminded of how crowded the place was.